Raise your hand if you want your nails to look perfect all the time. Me too. I'm Sarah Gibson-Tuttle from Olive & June, and this is exactly why we created the Mani system. We wanted to make it possible for everyone everywhere to give themselves a beautiful manicure at home. With our tools and our long-lasting polish, each manicure with our Mani system comes out to just $2. That's right, $2. No more $30, $40, $50 manis that you get at a salon and they take hours. Now you can paint your nails on your time and love them more than ever. And by the way, when people ask, who did your nails? Where did you get them done? You're going to proudly say, I did them myself. Get 20% off your first Mani system with code DIYNail20 at oliveandjune.com/DIYNail20. That's code DIYNail20 for 20% off at oliveandjune.com/DIYNail20.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
If your water is good enough to drink, it's good enough to brew with. This trope is likely familiar to anybody who started brewing, well, about a decade or so ago. Though, due to a better understanding of the impact water quality actually has on beer, it seems to be trending downward, which is probably a good thing overall. While a good amount of focus when it comes to the subject of water chemistry tends to be on the mineral makeup of brewing water, many brewers also view mash pH as being an important factor and rely on a handful of methods for adjusting it. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the use of slaked lime as a means of increasing mash pH, particularly in an oatmeal stout, is contributor Will Lovell.
Slaked lime, what a great name for something. Doesn't it just sound disgusting? But it is used in some really cool things. So it's an antifungal. It's used in sewage processes. So apparently it's a pretty versatile thing, and apparently you can use it in beer as well. So let's set it up with all the grossness that you can do with something called slaked lime.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about other things that it's called as well, but it's not just used in sewage treatment. We all know that. It's used in brewing. Now, sitting in my brew freezer right now is a nearly full bag of what I bought as pickling lime, which is the same thing as slaked lime. I bought it all the way back in 2017, over 8 years ago, specifically for the purpose of adjusting my mash pH up when it was expected to drop below the recommended, quote, ideal range. In fact, it was my experiment on the impact of high mash pH that motivated me to purchase this big bag of slaked lime. And for the sake of complete transparency, it was those results that explain why I still have it sitting in my freezer. I'll be the first to admit that my opinions on the importance of mash pH have changed quite a bit over the last few years, thanks in part to our experimentation as well as my own anecdotal experience. But I totally understand and fully accept that others don't share this opinion. And in a way, that makes this all the more interesting of a topic for us to talk about today. All right, I'm going to go a little off script here for a minute. I mean, you've all heard me say essentially the same thing in every episode for years at this point. And while I hate to come across as desperate, I just feel like this is something that needs to be said. I've been getting a lot of emails lately of people asking how we're faring because of the downturn in brewing and such. So all of us at Brewlosophy love brewing and beer. We're still knuckles deep in this hobby and love playing our part, not only educating brewers, but providing a source of entertainment as well. When we started Brewlosophy all the way back in 2014, and when this podcast started a few years later in 2017, this industry was absolutely rocking. We had sponsors hitting us up nonstop, knocking at our door to the point we committed to working with only those who offered products that we use ourselves. It wasn't making anybody rich, but it kept the lights on while allowing us to make the necessary purchases to produce the content that we do with very little financial stress. Unfortunately, this has changed quite drastically over the last few years, which has led to us being forced to generate revenue in, let's just call it, less desirable ways. Yes, I get your emails about this, and my lack of a response is not because you've upset me or I don't value your opinion. I actually mostly agree and wish we didn't have to resort to this, but when the only other option is to shut things down, well, it's the only other option, or that's not the only other option. Look, perhaps this is a function of naivete, but I'm confident the tides will turn at some point, and we're going to see another boom. There's just no way of predicting when that's going to happen, and we can't just press pause when sponsors pull out because their businesses are struggling, which kills us. This is why Patreon is so important for us. At this point in time, no joke, Patreon is our single largest source of financial support, without which we would not be doing this podcast right now. You wouldn't be hearing it weekly. You wouldn't be reading our articles every week, and you would not be watching the Brulosophy Show. If you happen to feel like our constant promotion of Patreon is shill or whatever, just consider this. Our patrons are the reason that we're here today. They are responsible for this podcast that you are listening to right now. And as cheesy as it may sound, there really aren't words to express how much we appreciate all of our patrons for allowing us to continue to bring you this show, the website, the Brulosophy Show. So I'm going to step off of my soapbox for a minute. I wanted to say that because I have gotten a lot of emails lately of people asking me about certain changes that they've noticed on the website, on the podcast as well. So if you enjoy this show and you want to help us to continue producing it, please, please, please consider becoming a patron of Brulosophy, which you can do over at patreon.com/Brulosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you're going to receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Not to mention, it is through those patrons that we will eventually be able to get back to taking away some of these other weird forms of revenue generation. Now, coming up later this month, May of 2025, longtime member of the brewing community and an innovator in his own right, the dude credited with introducing Brut IPA to the masses, Kim Sturdivant, will be hanging out with patrons. If this name is unfamiliar to you, it's likely that you're relatively new to brewing, because Brut IPA was all the rage a few years back, to the point most well-known craft breweries were making their own versions of it. I'm really excited for this one and trust it's going to be quite unique. To be part of this session, all you have to do is make a pledge of just $3 or more by Friday, May 30th, 2025, as Kim's going to be taking questions on Saturday the 31st. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brulosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brulosophy.com/support. When you're shopping online, you're going to do the same exact shopping experience as usual, and we get a tiny commission just for you clicking that link. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and both are really awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not quite ready to make the jump to electric, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits that are awesome. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor, visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, listener Brian Ravola left a question on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/Brulosophy. After listening to our recent episode focused on the mash out step, Brian said, you said the Imperial L28 Urkel was fermented at 66F or 19C in a temp controlled chamber. Why 66F? This seems a bit warm for this yeast. Was this intentional or the only option for the brewer? Well, Brian, we are insanely glad that you're here. Thank you for the question. It does leave me wondering how maybe new you are to Brulosophy, though, only because we've sort of made a name for ourselves as the blaspheming brewers who tend to lean into unconventional approaches, one of the more controversial being lager fermentation temps. Speaking personally, I have no desire to entice others to brew like me or even convince them to accept that I do things the way I do, but having fermented many a delicious lager with the Pilsner Urquell strain, which is L28, at ale temperatures, and Phil no longer being on the crew, I'm happy to speak to this. He could easily have fermented it cool. He had the ability to do so, but he opted not to because that particular strain is quite robust and doesn't seem to be as sensitive to temperatures as many believe. and cue all of the hate mail. I'm sure I'm going to get a ton of it. Will, what do you think, man?
So I think there's this kind of like a common thing that said it's like, lager yeast likes cold. I'm like, well, it tolerates cold. I don't think it likes it. It reproduces much faster when it's warm. So I think it's kind of a strange thing. Now, there are different flavors that are purported to be suppressed in cold. But the reality is like I haven't actually brewed a traditional lager. I've done one in like the last 3 years probably. So and I've been happy with my results and even getting some love at some competitions with some medals here and there. So for me personally, I'm doing actually my first warm ferment with Urkel right now. I just kegged it the other day, and so I'm really excited to see how that turns out. But I've been doing warm fermented lagers for a long time. I've had a lot of really great success with it, both anecdotally and in competitions. Mm-hmm. So I'm just, for me personally, I think it's kind of a non-issue anymore. And I think we need to get over that whole thing. Well, lagers like colds. I'm like, well, they tolerate it. They put up with it. They can do something in there, but there's a reason you have to pitch, a 5-liter starter when you're going at 40 degrees versus you can do a single pouch and get by with it. So
yeah, I'll tell you that when it comes to lager yeast, particularly the Pilsner Urquell strain, my bigger concern is just the lag. And it's not that I'm afraid of lag in general. It's that we could do a whole other episode on this, even though we've already done it. But it's not that like an extended lag kills me. I'm just impatient and I want to see activity in my beer as soon as possible. By fermenting warm, not only are you not producing this feared, ester profile that so many people up until about 15 years ago talked about, at least in my experience, but you're decreasing that lag. It takes a lot less time for that yeast to get going. And I don't know what it is about the Pilsner Urquell strain, but it does seem to lag a little bit longer than, say, the Weihenstephan strain or something like that. Now, just to be clear, we completely understand your question and appreciate you asking it, Brian. This wasn't meant to make you sound. I get this question all the time. So fermentation temperature is certainly one of the more fascinating brewing variables, at least in my opinion, which may explain why we've tested it out as many times as we have. I would recommend you head over to brewlosophy.com. You can go to the experiments tab, and there's a searchable table in there where you can just put fermentation temperature, and all of those experiments that we've done in the past will show up. Read through those. There's some really interesting data in there. If you're open to the risk, I would recommend giving it a shot. I think you'll be surprised with the outcome. I certainly was. So, well, if you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on the use of slaked lime as a way to adjust mash pH.
If you love smash burgers, the crispy edges, bold, beefy flavor, you need to try Omaha Steaks' all-new smash burgers. They're pre-smashed, made with 100% extra-aged beef, and grill-ready. No mess, no griddle. I tossed a few on the grill last weekend, straight from freezer to bun in just 5 minutes. The sear? Perfect. The flavor? Rich, juicy, and seriously next level. Way better than anything I've had from the store. Plus, I grabbed the Built for the Grill pack at omahasteaks.com/smash and scored 16 smash burgers free. With high-quality meats always on hand, I'm already eyeing my next order. Maybe there's steak burgers or that killer bacon-wrapped filet. Family-owned since 1917, Omaha Steaks brings 5 generations of premium quality delivered right to your door. Smash burger lovers, this is your moment. Get ready to smash expectations with new Omaha Steaks smash burgers. Visit omahasteaks.com/smash and order the Built for the Grill pack with 16 free smash burgers. That's 16 free Omaha Steaks smash burgers at omahasteaks.com/smash. See site for details.
Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Without the mash, you can't really have beers. It's during this step that starches get converted to the fermentable sugars metabolized by yeast during fermentation. So it's really no surprise that brewers pay close attention to the mash, with pH being an important component of that, at least for some. Now, we've done a few episodes on mash pH in the past, so some of what we talk about today may be a little bit redundant, but repetition is good for learning. Why don't we start off with some basics of pH, Will?
Yeah, so I guess the first question is what is pH? And it really is just a scale used to define how acidic or basic a water-based solution is. And, it's a scale most of you already know from, fifth grade science. It goes from 0 to 14. 7, dead in the middle, is neutral. That's what we normally associate with distilled water. If you're going below 7, 0 to 6.9 or whatever, then you're starting to get on the acidic side of the scale. And if you go above 7, you're starting to get on the basic side of the scale. So, if we think of things of acids and bases, low is acidic, high is basic.
Yeah, and just for a point of clarification, if the term base or basic sounds like we're talking about something simple or normal, all we're saying is we're using the term base to refer to a more alkaline solution in this episode. So that those are interchangeable. If we go back and forth, I do apologize. That's just kind of the way my brain works. So yeah, and so when we take pH and then we kind of overlay that on the brewing world, really I think the biggest focus is on the mash, though I know that there are brewers out there who focus pretty heavily on wort pH as well as the finished beer pH. Obviously, if you're making sour beer, that's going to be a thing that you focus on. But even in standard, non-funky, non-sour beers, beer pH is going to have an impact. The focus of this episode is specifically on mash pH, but we don't want anybody to think we're negating those other elements. So when I started getting into water chemistry, this was about 11 or 12 years ago. It was when I really, and I abided by that whole claim of if your water is good enough to drink, then your water is good enough to brew with. And no one, I'm sitting there going, but my water is good. Why does my beer taste weird every once in a while? Because my water was good enough to drink, but it wasn't good enough to brew with, in my opinion. So one of the things that I was taught, though, is that you want to have your mash pH after about 10 to 15 minutes into your mash, and you pull that sample for your mash pH, measuring it at room temperature, it should fall anywhere between about 5.2 to 5.6 pH. And because of the fact that if it's in that range, and I would love to read like papers on whoever tested this and figured this out. If it's within that range, then there's a number of things that purported benefits, we'll say, which we'll get to, that will occur. If it's outside of that range, those benefits start to dwindle and you may actually have some consequences. Now, the typical pH of the mash sans adjustment. So without making any adjustments to that pH in general, it's going to depend on your starting water and grain bill first off, and it usually falls somewhere within that ideal range for most styles. Now, there are certain styles that are going to push it or potentially push it out of that range. Again, just a little side note, you have to measure this stuff to know where you're at. You have to know what your starting water is. You have to know what your grain bill is in order for you to even roundabout guess what your mash pH is going to be. So what are some of the purported benefits that you get from adjusting your mash pH to be within that ideal range?
So, like you said, it all depends on your starting water. I know here in San Antonio, I have really alkaline water if I use it from the tap because we get ours from the Edwards Aquifer. And so, so you can really do a calculator, and if you're trying to use RO water as your baseline, you're going to be way off of where you think you're going to be for mash pH. So you got to measure it. But purported benefits, supposedly it'll improve starch conversion. Again, getting in that nice acidity range is going to help you convert all those starches during the mash. So that's a pretty big thing. Purportedly, you get better flavor from having the appropriate pH in the mash. We do have some experiments kind of going through mash pH, including this one. So maybe there is or isn't something to there. And then this one's always interesting to me, where people claim you're going to get better clarity because 5.2 to 5.6 isn't like a huge rock star difference, in that range. And so are you really going to get better clarity? So, but supposedly a high mash pH has been shown to contribute to a strong hot break during the boil compared to a lower mash pH. So supposedly you'll get better clarity. I don't know that I've experienced that or not experienced that, but that is a very curious claim in my book.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So I performed, I'm going to talk a little bit about some other experiments we've done on pH because it did inform my perspectives that I hold today. But when I performed the high mash pH experiment, and by that we were comparing a intentionally high mash pH to a more normal mash pH. That wort, when I was boiling it, had a hot break that I had never seen before. It looked like genuine egg drop soup. Usually when I'm adjusting my mash pH to be within that 5.2 to 5.6 range, I'm seeing more of a kind of smaller chunks of hot break. It still falls out of solution and you get clear wort, but I do think that's interesting. And I did wonder, is that going to contribute to the clarity of the beer as well? Well, it didn't in that experiment, but perhaps it does for some people. Oddly enough, if you go looking online at what the impact of mash pH, different mash pH levels have on clarity, the verdict seems to be out because there are people who claim that lower mash pH resulted in their beer being clear. There are people who claim that the opposite, high mash pH did. So again, try it out for yourself. Maybe it's style dependent. There are probably a million other factors that play into it. So there are some issues with mash pH that people claim as well. If you're too low, if you're outside of that range on the lower end, so lower than 5.2, there are claims that you'll get poor conversion due to reduced alpha amylase activity, which is affected by those lower pH levels. This can limit your hop bitterness and aroma because low pH reduces the solubility of hop acids. So that's something to keep in mind if you're brewing a lot of, hoppy IPA or pale ale, whatever that might be. This can result in thinner mouthfeel and body as well as poor foam quality. And then if that mash pH goes too high, so if it's above 5.6, it can reduce conversion and reduce attenuation as well. Just because kind of the similar reason if it's too low, it's really more that Goldilocks zone where you want where people claim at least that mash pH is going to work the best. A couple of other things that are really associated with high mash pH that I think is important to pay attention to is the fact that tannin extraction is a function of pH, and it's going to happen with that higher mash pH more than it is a lower mash pH. That can result in astringency in the finished beer. But then probably the number one comment that I hear related to higher mash pH is that it can result in a beer that's, quote, flabby, which just means, or at least my interpretation of that, is that it lacks that crisp, refreshing drinkability that you expect in most beer styles. I mean, even darker styles, to me, you still want it to be crisp like a beer and not just this kind of flabby, undefined beer that you're putting into your mouth.
Yeah, and I wonder if that flabby descriptor, because, again, I say I have highly alkaline water, very basic water here, I guess, with all the bicarbonate in it. And I think part of that is just like when you start with kind of those really high minerally waters, you have to do something to kind of overcome that alkalinity. Otherwise, I agree. Like if you have that much minerality, you can get kind of some flabby, weird mouthfeel kind of beers that just don't taste quite right. Like if you try to make a lager with just my water coming from the tap without doing any acid or any kind of adjustments, it ain't right. I can just tell you that off the bat.
Well, here's an interesting little anecdote. I have a buddy, Sean Wood. He's been on the show before. He was he helped to kickstart the sour program at House of Pendragon many, many years ago. He has notably hard water. He lives about 15 miles, 10, 15 miles west of where I live. So we're completely different water plants. He makes amazing lager and IPA. His hoppy beers are so phenomenal. Every beer he makes, I think, is good. But these beers just have this insane crisp drinkability. He has way more alkaline water than I do. I have the water that I get. I haven't tested the water at my new house, but what I was brewing with at the old place was basically Pilsen water. It was like nothing in it. It was amazing. So I could build whatever I wanted. he would just use his water, filtered through the tap, and these beers are coming out wonderful. Well, the reason I bring that up is because there's this concept of buffering. I am not by any means a chemist, or, I don't understand the depths of that in the way that somebody like John Palmer might. But what I do know is that when we talk about buffering capacity, all we're saying is that something else that's in this solution is going to help to resist the changes in pH that adding other stuff may otherwise cause, right? So the biggest thing that we're talking about here is malt. If this is why it's so important to understand your starting water and your grain bill before you start making adjustments. Like, you don't want to go willy-nilly into mash pH adjustments. When I said earlier that for the most part, your beers are likely going to end up in that 5.2 to 5.6 range, whether you adjust your mash pH or not, that's based not only on anecdote, that's based on this idea that these malts that we use have a very strong buffering capacity. They're going to pull that pH into that ideal range for the most part anyways. There's just certain circumstances, if you're paying attention to it, where, I guess the professionals and science, I put that in air quotes as well, would tell you, yeah, you might need to adjust it on this one. So the purpose of adjusting your mash pH, all you're doing is adding a substance to bring the mash pH into the ideal range. That's all it is. Now, most of the time, in my experience, when you're making most styles of beer, if anything, if it's not already going to land in that ideal range, you're going to be adjusting it down because the pH is just going to be a tad too high. Now, this occurs. The reason I think that this is so common is because this is going to occur when you're using mostly paler grists, right? Things with pale malt or Pilsner style malts, which are very, very pale. And the way to adjust it down is you just use any handful of, acids that are out there to do that. Common acids, if you're not going to use something like acid malt or acidulated malt, which is just lactic acid sprayed over the top of malt, like a Pilsner malt, you can use liquid lactic acid, phosphoric acid, citric acid. There are others out there, but those are probably the three main ones. And you use very little to bring that mash pH down to where you want it to be. Adjusting your mash pH up, there are very specific situations in which we would do this. And I'll let Will kind of go into this, but it's a little bit different. You've got to find some other chemicals that you're obviously not going to be adding acids. You'll be adding something that's more alkaline.
Right. Well, as we know that when you add high portions of roasted grains, there is a tendency to drive that mash pH down, making everything a little bit more acidic, as it were. And so those Maillard reactions, they involve carbohydrates, amino acids breaking down. So you're going to get much more naturally acidic. And so anytime you add crystal malt, chocolate malt, roasted barley, black patent malt, any of these really dark grains are going to start pushing that pH down. And so there are a lot of methods for increasing mash pH. Some of them are chemical, some of them are non-chemical. A couple of really popular non-chemical methods are capping the mash, and then another one is steeping your roasted grains post-wort mash. So capping the mash is basically where you are going to go in and you're going to add the dark malts. You're going to leave them out of your mash until basically the very end when you're about almost ready to disparge. You're just basically putting them in right at the tail end so they don't have enough time to let all that acidity kind of get into the mash or affect the mash pH during the actual mash step itself. Another thing to do is you can actually steep roasting grains basically in your brew kettle after the mash is done, and that way you still get all that color and some of that flavor, again, without getting the acidity that could affect the mash and what's going on with your mash pH. So those are two very common non-chemical methods.
So we've tested both of these as well. Now, steeping roasted grains in your wort in the kettle, like prior to your boil, is going to be very familiar to people who started off with using extract and steeping grains. That method, that's exactly what I did. There are people who, in order to avoid having to adjust their mash pH up, will just do that still, even when they're brewing all grain. They just reserve their roasted grains and they steep it in the wort. And, it works. I personally feel like there's something about, let's even call it the acidity of these roasted grains, that contributes to the gestalt of these styles of beer that require these types. Now, maybe if you're making a Schwartz beer or something like that, but if you're making a stout or a porter, my opinion, in my experience again, is that I tend to prefer just doing everything together anyways. And in those times, if you're going to be, way too low because of the acidity of those roasted grains, then you may have to go the chemical route. In the same way that we adjust pH down using chemical acids, you can adjust pH up using chemical alkalis. One of the most popular that gets talked about, and I remember this was the first thing that I bought when I got into water chemistry, is calcium carbonate, which just is also known as chalk. It's a base that, when dissolved, releases carbonate and bicarbonate ions that increase alkalinity, thus countering the acidity of the mash. Now, the beauty of this, and the reason I bought it, is one, it gets talked about a lot, or at least it used to. It's very cheap, very easily accessible. It's safe. You can rub this stuff all over your body and it's not going to hurt you. The big issue with, I bet you already know what I'm going to say, Will. The big issue with chalk is what?
Doesn't really dissolve all that well.
It doesn't dissolve at all.
Just look at your driveway after your kids mark it up and then it rains and you're like, it still didn't go away. Why?
It's like completely hydrophobic. I remember when the first time I got chalk, it was sitting at the bottom of the kettle. I used to do adjustments to the kettle and then I'd add the water on top to kind of mix it in. I now do the opposite, actually. But I remember just seeing this white stuff kind of floating around in there, and it just did not dissolve. I was talking with Palmer about this many years ago, and he goes, "Oh yeah, common issue." And I think it was him who told me that you actually have, in order to get it dissolved properly, you have to make other additions. And if I'm not mistaken, they have to be acid additions. I'm like, that seems to be counterintuitive. But anyways, chalk, very easy to get, very cheap, not very effective because of the fact it doesn't fully dissolve into the water and thus isn't going to have the intended impact that we're hoping for. So there are other options.
Yeah, my favorite actually is sodium bicarbonate, and the reason it's my favorite is because it's baking soda, and we just have it in our pantry, and so I don't have to go out and buy something special. It does release bicarbonate ions, and when they which dissolve in water, and then neutralizes excess hydrogen ions that are responsible for acidity, and thus increases pH. Kind of the bummer, if you're worried about it, is it could increase your sodium content, so you have to kind of keep an eye on that little checkbox when you're making your water chemistry additions. But to me, I've probably used this more than any other substance for adjusting pH going that way, just simply because it's in my pantry. But typically, if I really, really want to adjust pH in my house, I just use my tap water, and that'll make it plenty basic. But then,
because you're so alkali, your San Antonio water is so hard.
Oh man, it is so hard. And then kind of the last one, which is kind of the belle at the ball today, is our calcium hydroxide, which is slaked lime or pickling lime. Lots of different names for this. And it is a base that, when dissolved in water, releases hydroxide ions, which neutralize hydrogen ions, thereby increasing pH. And this is a pretty cool little thing. I think I teased a little earlier. They do use it in sewage. They use it in like dentistry as well, like for root canals, because it's safe and it's pretty inert and doesn't really hurt anything. Again, you can kind of rub it all over your body. And it also has some antifungal and antimicrobial effects, which also would kind of be like, hey, why wouldn't you want that in your beer per se, just to kind of put it in there for some of those reasons. So it is a truly useful substance.
Yeah, it's used a lot, actually, in ways that I didn't realize until I was researching this. Just a comment, you had mentioned sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, being it is insanely effective at increasing your mash pH. The only issue that I can come up with, you talked about the sodium aspect of it. I was highly warned of this when I was talking with folks years ago about, I think I'm just going to use, why wouldn't I use baking soda? I have very low sodium water in the first place, so it's not a big issue for me. I can add the amount of baking soda I need to get my mash pH where I want it, and it's not going to have at least a negative flavor impact. It may even positively impact the flavor. That little bit of sodium, it's salt, that's a flavor enhancer. If you're starting water, if you live in a region and you're going to go with your tap water, that sodium is not going to be filtered out with your standard RV filter. I believe sodium does get filtered out with an RO filter, but again, now you're using RO water, and you're more than safe to use sodium bicarbonate because it's so low anyways. That's the biggest thing to keep in mind with that. There's really not much to worry about with pickling or slaked lime. Calcium is a yeast nutrient. You can get up to 150 ppm of calcium or so, and probably not have any issue. You can go even higher than that for certain styles. You're really not going to have many issues. It contributes to yeast health, as well as, at least from what I've heard, beer clarity, higher calcium levels. I think most people aim for keeping it above 50 at a minimum anyways. Again, my starting calcium is like 26. So I add a little bit of slaked lime, not a big issue. So those are just things to keep in mind. I have found that when I was doing my pH adjustments, the very few times that I did it with really dark beers that were pulling that acidity down, that slaked lime was the most effective and easy to use. You can measure it right away. It dissolves easily, and it's almost as cheap as baking soda. So you can go to Walmart and buy a bag of it today for like $4. So now, how do you use this stuff? The same way you use pretty much any other brewing mineral or salt or whatever. You dissolve it in your brewing liquor prior to the mash, and then the amount that you're using, again, to reiterate, is going to be completely dependent on your batch size, your starting water, and your grist. And there are some calculators out there right now that are so insanely accurate at predicting how much you need to add to hit your target. We use the Brewfather app, and it works phenomenally well. For a typical 5-gallon mash, 5.5 to 6 gallon mash, whatever it is, you're looking to add about 4 to 7 grams of pickling lime. I mean, it is nothing. Again, I still have almost a full bag in my freezer because you use so little. You're basically sprinkling tiny little crystals into your water, and it does the trick.
Yeah, that's kind of my experience with all these as well. Is they're super easy. Slaked lime is really easy to use, and and what is it? Just it's less than 7 grams typically in a 5-gallon batch, depending on where you're starting. So honestly, I agree. It's a pretty great way to go, but still that sodium bicarbonate. It's just in my kitchen shelf, so I don't have to think about it too hard. So, but I now have probably a lifetime supply of it after buying a bag of it at Walmart. So it's pretty simple. Since I kind of wanted to test out slaked lime and adjusting mash pH and potential flavor effects of using slaked lime, that brings us to the style of oatmeal stout, where you would potentially add a bunch of roasted grains that might affect your pH.
Yeah, absolutely. In very rare occasions, there might be people using water that is just going to need to have the pH adjusted, because if that's your source water and you love the beer you're making, by all means, I would try something else though, because I like having more of a neutral start. But for the most part, you're going to have to adjust your pH using a base like this when to bring that pH up when you're using a big portion of roasted grains, and that can include anything from Crystal 10 all the way up to Special B and roasted barley and black patent. Oatmeal stout's an ideal candidate for this type of an experiment because it relies on quite a big chunk of these roasted grains. Now, the BJCP describes oatmeal stout as a dark, roasty, full-bodied stout with enough sweetness to support the oat backbone. The sweetness balance and oatmeal impression can vary considerably. So, again, it requires a relatively high portion of dark grains. What might we expect from an oatmeal stout that we don't adjust the pH up from so that mash is going to be acidic? Well, we already talked about it a little bit. You might get a little bit, you might, in my opinion, based on my own anecdotal experiences, I would expect to maybe see an impact to conversion because of dropping below that lower pH. But I don't know what I'd expect flavor-wise. What might you expect if it's out of that range in terms of flavor?
Maybe if it gets too acidic, maybe you'd expect poor foam quality, which again, that oatmeal stout, you're known for having kind of that thick, creamy head on it. Maybe they would affect the mouthfeel in the body because, again, oatmeal stout is all about body that purportedly comes from the oats and some of what's going on there. Low pH, you're not worried about hop bitterness in this one, but you could definitely get poor conversion and maybe some poor head quality, maybe a thinner mouthfeel than you would expect going the other way.
Yeah, so you notice that neither of us are talking about very concrete, perceptible, like the flavor and aroma differences. I know there are people out there who are going to make a claim that, but you could taste, it's going to be acidic. It's going to taste like a sour beer. It's not. You've got so many other malts in there that are going to buffer that pH, that are going to bring it up naturally anyways, that I think more of what we would see, this is just personal opinion, is going to be in kind of the objectively observable aspects of that beer. Like you said, maybe poor foam quality. It might affect clarity. Oatmeal stout, the only way you're going to see that is if you're looking at the edge of your glass. But Over the years, I've brewed probably 15 to 20 batches of dark beer like this, from brown ale and porter to the various styles of stout, before I started taking water chemistry seriously. So I wasn't doing any adjustments, and none of those beers were bad enough for me to dump. In fact, some turned out great, and I've even won awards with beers that dark beers that I didn't do any adjustments to the water chemistry. However, once I accepted the importance of water chemistry, which involved making mash pH adjustments, I did feel like my beers improved, but did they really, or was it something like bias playing a role? That's exactly what you aim to test out in a recent experiment, Will. Results from that when we're back from this break.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. For a good 3 years or so, I absolutely obsessed over my mash pH. I think there are other brewers out there who can relate, and I was making sure that it fell within the ideal range for every single batch, which meant acidifying paler beers and alkalifying darker beers. While I started off using chalk, I soon found that other options worked much better, especially slaked lime. But was it actually having this positive impact that I thought it was? Will, you put it to the test in an oatmeal stout.
Oh, yes. So to test this, I did maybe I went a little roastier than I normally would for this recipe, but I did 2 5.5 gallon batches of oatmeal stout, 34% Maris Otter, 34% Tex Malt Wildfire Pale Malt. I got Golden Naked Oats in there at 7%, along with 7% of flaked oats, just to kind of make sure I got all that oaty goodness in there of both the malted and the flaked varieties. And then we kind of got to the things that we would expect to contribute to a lower pH, like 6% chocolate malt, 6% roasted barley, and 6% C60.
So if you look at that, we are at 18% roasted grains. That's a pretty good chunk. You know, there are styles that you might bump it up to above 20%, sure, but I would say for an oatmeal stout, 18%, and that roasted barley and chocolate malt, you know, C60 is 60 love. Roasted barley can range anywhere from about 250 all the way up to 500 love. Chocolate malt, I think, falls in that 350 to 400 love range. This is going to be a mash that's going to get pulled down in acidity or in pH because of the acidity of those grains. So I think is a good recipe for this test.
Right. And when you look at suggested roasted, malt amounts for things like oatmeal stout, around 12% is really where people tell you to kind of top it out. So we were kind of pushing the max of what most people say is a good oatmeal stout kind of recipe. So, I mean, could you go higher? Sure. But then you're starting to get outside of the realm of having a ton of roasted malt in there, which, I want to make some good beer here too. So I got to drink the stuff later. Yeah. So for the process, I collected 2 identical volumes of RO water, put them in my Delta all-in-one brewing systems. To one batch, I added 5.5 grams of slaked lime, and while the other one received none. And so I basically had a Brewfather, and as I was plugging in all this stuff, Brewfather said with my water profile using RO, which should give us a pH of right around 7 since it's RO water, maybe just a little bit below, it was going to get me to a mash pH of 5.6, which is on that upper end after adding that slaked lime.
We obviously discuss these things as we're designing experiments, and we all agreed this is perfect, right? Because this is going to bring up that mash pH to the higher end of the range from this lower. We're expecting it to be quite low. The beauty of doing a side-by-side comparative experiment like this is that control batch is going to show us this is what it would have been. Let's see where it is because of this pH adjustment. And then obviously, is there a perceptible difference in those? I think this is really interesting and a testament to how accurate the Brewfather calculator and many other calculators out there, but how accurate they are, because you ended up mashing both of these at 153 Fahrenheit, 67 C for 60 minutes. And then 20 minutes into each mash, you pulled samples, chilled them down to room temperature, and took pH readings. And sure enough, the one without slaked lime was at 5.2. We're going to get back to that because I think this is interesting. The one with the slaked lime was definitely higher at 5.5. It was only 0.3 pH higher, which it was probably like 5.55 or something, which we could have rounded up to 5.6. But man, if you know your starting water and you plug in your grist and then you use one of these calculators to determine the amount of a substance to add to get to this pH, the fact that it can predict it so closely, I think is really cool. Now, I think, again, in your head, you're like, all right, I've got 18% roasted grains going into this mash with starting RO water. It's going to pull this acidity down to below this ideal range. It didn't do that. It pulled it down to 5.2. And that is like right where the lower end of the range. So now you're comparing a lower end of the range to a higher end of the range, but neither are necessarily outside of that range, which speaks to how powerful that buffering capacity is, at least in my opinion.
I was very impressed because even with Brewfather, I was kind of expecting it with the amount of roasted grains I had in there to be right at around 5.1, 5.2. I was impressed with how spot on it was with the one that wasn't treated. Yeah. And then again, to be within 0.1, at some change, 5.5, 5.6, somewhere in that range with the slaked lime, I was super impressed that Brewfather got it that close. And so I great calculators, great estimations. And then my pH meter really did appreciate the dusting off and recalibration because it has not been getting the workout that it once did.
Oh, you and me both, my friend. I don't even care about mash pH anymore these days, but we're still going to test it out because we know a lot of people do. So you have 5.2 versus 5.5. Just one last note on that. If you showed me this without, couching it in the fact that it's an experiment that we're performing, I would think, those are more or less the same. The reality is they're not. One of these has a alkali substance in it, slaked lime, 5.5 grams at least, bringing that pH up. So in a way, would we still expect to see some sort of an impact, flavor impact, objectively observable impact like foam quality or whatever? I guess I would kind of think so if I hadn't had the oodles of anecdotal experience that I do with mash pH. So still a valid comparison. Again, I just want to point out your mash is probably going to fall within the ideal range, whether you acidify or alkalify your wort or your mash. Anyways, it's just a powerful thing like that. So
well, and one thing we haven't really talked about too is like adding 5.5 grams of slaked lime. We're adding calcium hydroxide, so we're adding a lot of calcium to this one. So pH aside, let's couch pH. The water chemistry of these is vastly different with the amount of calcium that's going to be in one versus the other. And so to me, that I'm like, so part of me is like, well, is the pH going to make a difference, or as a function of the variable is just the fact that we have this, much higher calcium content for this other beer going to make all the difference. But that's a function of the variable. It's a function of how things work. We knew that was going to happen just based off of calculators and adding slaked lime. So to me, that's almost like as big a deal as the pH is just how much more calcium is in this one over the other. So
yeah, exactly.
So when mashes were complete, I removed the grains and proceeded to boil the worts for 60 minutes. I made a 60-minute addition of Warrior, which was about 8 grams. And then at 30 minutes, I did a 50-gram hop addition of Willamette. And so, kind of a nice little typical oatmeal stout, get the bittering hops in and then get something a little more earthy and a little more English in there, even though it's an American kind of knockoff. But I still think Willamette is a great American substitute for things like other English varieties or British varieties. So, and then after the boil, the worts were chilled, transferred to sanitized fermenters. OG was 1056 for both, so they both wound up about where I expected them to be.
Record scratch. See, I would have expected that if you're putting effort into adjusting your mash pH with the understanding that perhaps the biggest impact it's going to have, at least if you go and look in homebrewing forums and such online right now, most of the focus, it seems, when we're talking about water chemistry in terms of mash pH adjustment, is the more objective stuff. So the impact it's going to have on conversion. I would have expected, you're putting the effort into adjusting your mash pH. If you're doing that, you'd expect to see some sort of a positive, turnout. And in this case, you just didn't. I would have thought maybe the OG of the adjusted batch would be a little higher. I would hope for that, I guess, is a better way of putting it. Otherwise, what's the point, right? Well, maybe we'll see some downstream stuff, but in this case, they were the exact same OG, which, hey, cool.
No, I was really pleased as somebody that brews experiments all the time and doing 2 different grain bills, 2 different boils. Anytime you can get in the ballpark of having them being pretty close to the same, even within a couple of points, you feel pretty good about it. So, but obviously we've been doing this for a little while, so to nail it, it feels good. So after that, I pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast A09 Pub, which is kind of one of my go-to English ale yeasts. And then I fermented these beers at about 66F or 19C, which, after about 2 weeks, there was no activity. Things had settled out. Took hydrometer measurements, and then we showed a little bit of difference. This is kind of where I think the difference kind of came in downstream. The no slaked lime came in at 1018, and then the slaked lime actually came in at 1015, which might support some of that alpha amylase enzymatic activity that having too low of a mash pH might potentially affect. So maybe this supports some of that.
Here's the fork in the road. Now we're starting to see some sort of a benefit, and it's objective. This is measurable. This was easy to measure. We put a hydrometer in samples of both of these beers after fermentation. The one that had the water that completely was not treated at all, had no slaked lime in it, was 3 FG points higher than the slaked lime one, meaning 5% ABV in the no slaked lime batch, 5.4% ABV in the slaked lime batch. Now, we've shown over and over again that people generally aren't terribly good at detecting such small differences in alcohol content. So I'm not worried about that, but I do feel like, if you're designing a beer to finish out at 10-15 and using slaked lime does that, if it's a oatmeal stout or whatever, then I'm starting to go, okay, maybe it's worth it. Maybe there's some value here.
Exactly. And again, like, this is kind of lines up with what we talked about earlier, that you're going to get lower alpha amylase conversion with that kind of too low of a mash pH. And that kind of lines up here, right? Because it didn't ferment out quite as completely as the slaked lime version did. Again, 3 points. Honestly, in a normal brew, if my finishing gravity was off by 3 points, I probably wouldn't blink too hard at it.
Yeah.
But because anything within 3 points, I think is good enough.
Yeah, success.
in my day to day, I'm like, oh, cool, we got there. Yeah. But I understand if you're a perfectionist, then probably that slaked lime to get you that 10-15 might be where it's at.
Yeah.
After that, I cold crashed the kegs. I cold crashed overnight and then pressure transferred the beer into CO2 purged kegs, where I placed them on gas in my kegerator, let it condition for a couple of weeks. And then, now we get to look at them and see objectively if there's any difference in appearance, because that was one of the other things. Granted, these are very dark beers, so it's kind of hard to see much of a difference. But if you look at them, I'm looking at the pictures on the website. They both look like dark, beautiful oatmeal stouts, even with the light outside. So
yeah,
I'm not seeing much of a difference there.
I wouldn't turn away either of those glasses. I love oatmeal stout, but both had that really nice dark brown color with ruby highlights. I like to, if I'm doing a geeking out on the way a dark beer looks, I'll hold it up, kind of tilt the glass sideways, and just look at the bottom edge of the glass. And that both of them, you can see in the photo, they appear to be almost crystal clear, thanks in part to the A09 pub, but neither was murky or hazy, which, some of the claims about clarity when it comes to mash pH, I might have expected to see something different. They look identical to me. Both have a nice dark tan head. There's decent lacing on the glasses. They don't look, it doesn't look like the variable had much of an impact on appearance at the very least.
The lacing on both these beers looks absolutely amazing. The head retention on both these beers was absolutely great. I know some people like to think that's associated with the oatmeal. I'll be honest with you, I've had really great head retention when I use Tex malt. So when you saw my grain bill and you're like, why didn't you use 100% Maris Otter? Part of it is because I wanted that great head retention. And so cheaping out on the Maris Otter a little bit to sub in with some of that Tex malt, pale malt, that I've really had great luck getting great head retention with those. So I'm not really surprised that the head retention was great on this. And I also thought it would be a pretty good test to see if it would still carry through. So I think both these beers are absolutely gorgeous. 100% satisfied if I went to a bar, ordered a stout, and this is what came out. I would not turn either away. I'm in the same boat there, Marshall.
Yeah, like I said, they look identical to me. Obviously, when we're taking these photos, you have to pour one glass before the other. So there's usually going to be a little bit of a difference in the way certain things look just on that alone. But to me, they look more or less identical. Now, before we collect our blind taster data, we put ourselves through a series of what I call semi-blind triangle tests, usually served by somebody else to us, where we'll do 5 of these and then kind of, compile the data from that. Out of your 5 personal triangle tests, how many times were you able to select the odd beer out?
Well, I knew everything about these beers. I knew exactly when I added the Slaked lime. I've tasted them beforehand. I've been kind of trying to nail something down, and I got exactly 1 out of 5, which is not even random guessing. It's actually below random guessing. If I would have randomly guessed, I probably would have done better. But I guess to me, I couldn't tell the difference, and so we'll have to say that even though there was a slight difference in attenuation and a whole bunch of calcium in the water profile, I was unable to tell these beers apart.
And this is despite being intimately acquainted with these beers and knowing everything about them. This is why...
That's a double-edged sword, Marshall. That's a double-edged sword. Because you'll get something in your head. You'll get your own bias in your head and think, oh, I know why these are different because of these things that I've been told are the reason they should be different. And you get that in your head and it backfires on you. I really I think our blind tasters actually have a little bit of an advantage by not knowing what the variable is because they're not looking for anything. They're exploring everything and they're not using so much of that bias.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we care so much about their results more than me per se. So
I care about you a lot, Will. This is why we do the blind taste. We have talked over and over about should we set up a series where we repeat experiments that we've already done, but before actually collecting the data, you completely train tasters on what they should expect based on what the variable is. So they're almost as in the know as we are about it. We've done a few kind of side experiments on that, and it's never panned out. Despite knowing everything about the beer, the data from that compared to people who were blind during the triangle test was more or less the same. So we haven't gone that route yet. I see the argument for it, but we haven't gone that route. So in this case, you served these beers to 22 blinded participants, meaning they knew nothing about the variable in question for this experiment. Out of those 22, 12 would be expected at least to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence, not 100%, but some level of confidence, enough people got this that it seems like it may very well be a function of the variable, considering how similar these beers were brewed and how well we isolated the variable. Out of the 12 that you needed, so out of the 22 participants, we needed 12. How many actually were able to identify the odd beer out?
At the end of the day, only 8 tasters, which is 36%.
That's basically a third. Yeah.
Which is just right at a third, which is what we'd expect. In 3 cups, you would expect 33% chance of getting it right. And so it just lines up right there with blind guessing.
Yeah.
They did better than me. I couldn't even line up with blind guessing. So the way to go, tasters. You did better than me anyways. But it's still, we can say with some certainty that at least for this experiment with these 2 beers, tasters cannot reliably tell these beers apart.
Now, obviously, that means that mash pH adjustment is a waste of time. No, that is not at all what we're implying here. All we're saying is that in this specific experiment with an oatmeal stout that was made with 18%, roasted grains and everything else that was involved, tasters didn't appear to notice or perceive much of a difference in the beers. Now, again, they weren't comparing them on appearance. That's one piece of perception that we hide from them, because that's not really what we're interested in. We can tell you that, and we give you photos. What we were interested in is if they smell or, taste a difference in these beers. And curiously, they did not. Now, what could be the explanation for that? Well, like we talked about earlier, that Slaked Lime edition only brought the pH up from 5.2 to 5.5. So is that delta big enough to taste a difference? Maybe not. But then you view these results in light of the past experiment that I performed. I forget the exact numbers, but where I highly adjusted a beer with Slaked Lime to much higher, not much higher, but to definitely higher than the range. And people couldn't tell those beers apart either. So it starts to make me wonder, are we doing this pH adjustment primarily for, as a prophylactic to potential, a poor conversion and things that you may not necessarily taste on your palate? I will say that I would rather my beer be 5.4% if that's what I was aiming for than 5% if I wasn't aiming for it. So maybe, adjusting your pH up when you're making darker beers at least has that benefit. It's cheap enough. It's insanely easy. What are your thoughts? I mean, what do you extrapolate from this finding?
Well, these are dark beers, right? We went over it, and there was at least 12% of basically chocolate and roasted barley, and then you had another 18% with the C60. So there's a lot of character malts in here to add a lot of flavor. Yeah. And so part of me wonders if the perceptible difference is just covered up by these roasted malts. And we, there's a reason why really alkaline places like Ireland with their alkaline water are known for stout, right? There's a reason for that. So I'm kind of curious if it makes as much of a difference as we think it does, or maybe it does make a difference, and we just have this really robust malt bill that might be covering up that. But unless you're adding all this roasted malt, why would you adjust for your low mash pH unless you're using all these dark malts that are going to drive that pH down? So maybe if you did the same thing, but you did like I don't know, something crazy like a Helles, and you adjusted everything down with acid and then just bumped one back up. But that's not very practical other than just, a thought exercise.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I've not been shy about talking about this. I am a huge advocate of mineralizing your water to where you want it to be. I don't think, by the way, as an aside, matching a regional water profile is going to get most people to what they really want. I think you have to understand what certain mineral additions, namely sulfate and chloride, what those are going to contribute to your beer. And then experiment, and through iterative processes, you're going to figure out what it is that you like. I'm hardcore about that. I think that's very important for making the styles and or the beers with the type of characteristics that you desire. I couldn't care less about mash pH these days. And you know what? If I was a professional brewer and it cost me, $10 per batch to make sure my pH is where it was going to be so I could eke out a few more, points, whatever, I'm going to do that. As a home brewer, I couldn't care less. I don't worry about mash pH anymore. I have noticed, I went, 3 or 4 years where I was just doing, not even thinking about it. I would adjust my mash pH. I'd test it. It was easy. I just don't see the point anymore. I cannot figure out a good reason, at least with my brewing water and the types of beers that I make, maybe, for paying much attention to it these days. So that's where I'm at. There are people, I've got great friends who are absolutely adamant about adjusting their mash pH, testing it, doing all the old school stuff, and more power to them. Just for me, it's not a big deal. Now, we did get one reader comment I want to get to real quick. Wayne said, I found that Slaked Lime will keep the pH in check during the mash, but it precipitates out of solution during the boil. The result is that the pH drops to the point where it really didn't help keep the pH any higher than a beer without the Slaked Lime. The likely result is that both beers finished at roughly the same pH. Now, I don't know if Wayne is implying that mash pH adjustment leads to perceptible differences in the finished beer due to the impact it has on the pH of the fermented beer or not. I was kind of confused by that, but the I don't know if Slaked Lime actually precipitates out, right? When you put it in, there are chemical reactions that are naturally occurring and it's not going to reconvert back into Slaked Lime and then fall out of solution. So I'm a little confused by this comment.
Yeah, at least those calcium ions are hanging around, right? They've already gone off and bonded with some other things. I'm not a chemist. I'm not going to pretend to explain it.
Right.
But yeah, that reaction's happened. Those calcium ions are there. They're going to hang out. So I don't know. I think though, I've seen it in the past with other mash pH experiments where I think Malcolm did one way back in the day, and he did measure everything after the finished beer was all kind of said and done. And what you do seem to find is that there are other points in the process that seem to kind of correct the ship.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So if the pH is kind of low or kind of high, there are other points in the process, whether it's fermentation or whatever, where things kind of get corrected and kind of put back and right the ship into a more, normal range. It's just kind of funny how that works. But I do remember, like, specifically on this podcast, Malcolm talking about that quite a long time ago, since he hasn't been a contributor for a little while. But I do think there are just enough points in this whole process that it will right the ship. Maybe if you go too far out of whack, too many places, it won't. But I don't think you're going to precipitate out any of this slaked lime. I think those calcium ions are there to stay. It's going to go off and do those chemical reactions, and it's just going to be there. But I do think the mash pHs the pH downstream will tend to kind of self-correct and fall more in line with each other downstream.
That has consistently been my experience, and part of the reason, or what contributes to my perspectives on mash pH these days. Again, you do you. If you found that using the water that you use and the styles of beers that you make, that adjusting your mash pH to a specific, acidity or alkalinity, that it helps, then by all means do it. For me, it just hasn't had any impact that I could tell. And so I don't worry about it much these days. But that does bring us to the end of this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brulosophy Show, over at youtube.com/@TheBrulosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brulosophy Show. No umlaut needed. If you're listening to this podcast now, we're confident you're going to love the videos Martin's creating over at YouTube as well. And as always, you could read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brulosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.